Hey there, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Community Podcast, where we have conversations with folks that are building learning centric communities. I am super excited today to be joined by Sana Alimohamed, who is a playful learning designer working at Duara Education, as well as a master's student in Interactive Telecommunications, ITP, at NYU. I had the pleasure of meeting Sana at the Serious Play conference in Toronto in August of 2024. Sana, it's great to have you here. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
Absolutely. So, Sana, one of the things that I really enjoyed about not only your story when we met in Canada, but also the work that you're doing is how you've integrated playful design into the learning experience in many of the roles that you've had and what you're currently doing. So, I'd love to learn a little bit more about your story. What influenced you to become a learning designer specifically focused on play? And how did you get to where you are today?
So, this is a long, windy story, but I'll start you off at the very beginning. I grew up in rural South Carolina, and the reason that's relevant is because I'm a third culture kid. And so that means that nothing outside my house matched anything inside my house. And I didn't have this language when I was growing up, but now I can look back on that and say, I knew that there had to be some relationship between identity and storytelling and memory to create a coherent sense of self, but like I could not solve it. And I was very, very stymied and frustrated by kind of all of these forces around me. So I decided to go to college and I was like, I'm going to solve this. We're going to figure all of this out. And I majored in neuroscience and realized that this is not a 4-year solvable question. Like I could dedicate my entire life to it. But as much as I loved research and I really loved having that background, that it felt very much cloistered in specific spaces. And I wanted to be with the people, quote unquote. So, my first role was as a data analyst for a maternal and neonatal health nonprofit in Tanzania, where I was like, I'm going to change the world with numbers. Um, maybe if I were a physicist where numbers are the fabric of the universe, that would have been somewhat true. But as a data analyst where numbers were in my little cells on a spreadsheet, I quickly learned that what I was really doing was a poetic interpretation of the information we were getting. And as much as I loved research and data, this did not feel like the most effective way to make change. So I then moved to New York for the same nonprofit. I was now working in development communications where I really leaned into that poetic interpretation, but I still felt an ick because I felt like I was writing about the rich, or rather writing about the poor for the rich. And that didn't sit very well with after 1 year, I moved back home and I was like, great. I entered the working world. It chewed me up. It spat me out. I really wasn't sure what to do next when two very fortunate things happened. One, my family requested that I stay in the US. And because of the fraught relationship I had with South Carolina, I was really excited to look for roles in Hawaii, Alaska, and Puerto Rico. And two, while doom scrolling through this period of time, I came across a piece of news that Sesame Workshop, so the creators of Sesame Street, had won a $100 million MacArthur Foundation grant to create PTSD programming for refugee kids. And I was like, that's what I want to do with my background. Like, this is the cause I want to dedicate my life to. But I didn't have any media experience. So, very luckily, I found two part time AmeriCorps positions in Sitka, Alaska. One was as an ethnographic filmmaker, and one was as a children's play facilitator at a trauma center. And I was like, together, these are the keys that will take me to Sesame Street. I was in Alaska for about a year when I was going through deep winter, when a friend called and let me know that the high school she had gone to, the African Leadership Academy, was opening up a university branch in Mauritius, and they were looking for learning designers. And she was like, this is just a great environment. I think you'd be interested. And for me, that was the missing piece to get to Sesame Street. Like I now had the media background and I had the children's psychology background and I was like, learning design. This is the trinity that will take me there. So I hopped islands and hemispheres, very grateful to be in warmth again. And I was working at the African Leadership University for a couple of years in learning design, where I really got to crystallize what it was that I cared about. So I really cared about social impact, social justice. I did think learning design was a pathway to get there, but I felt that storytelling and play and fun and curiosity had to be inherent to the process. And I really wanted to work with children because they felt like omnipotent selves. So, working at that university, I was like, college students are a little more fully formed. Like, I really want to help shape when there is so much left to be shaped. So, very, very luckily, I got connected with Ubongo, which at the time was based in Tanzania and is now Pan African, which is a children's edutainment company that is based in Africa. And I started writing for them. And in writing for them, I finally got connected to the Sesame Street project that started me on this whole journey. And I wrote for Sesame Street. And then I was deep in the world of children's media, working for various organizations, when I had the privilege to be promoted. And when I was promoted, I realized that to move up in children's media, which is still a for profit industry, I was moving away from the values that had brought me to the industry in the first place. So that's when I took a step back and I tried to figure out, all right, what is it that I deeply care about? And for me, it was that learning aspect that was unshakable, right? Like there was no part of me that wanted, as much as I do think it is important to have profit in order to give back to the project that you're investing in. Like I wanted to have roles in which I could continue to live out my values no matter how high I got on the quote unquote ladder, however nonlinear my ladder was. And so that's when I began freelancing full time. And that's how I found projects like Duara that feel very value aligned and a nice niche for my very specific windy set of skills.
That's incredible, Sana. I mean, I think you've always stayed true to that core belief in empowering, students, and in really, I love what you mentioned about kind of children being that malleable medium which you could still influence and have be able to generate
Hopefully
so
for
much
good.
impact on. Hopefully for good, absolutely. That's
Yeah.
always the hope. But to be able to have that experience and to be able to have such a diverse set of projects that you've worked on throughout the world is actually quite remarkable. Uh, and I can already tell, Sana, you're a very gifted storyteller. What inspired your love for storytelling? I mean, just naturally sharing what you've been able to do in your life up until this point. What led you to view stories as a medium of expression?
So, kind of growing back up, or growing up, as I mentioned, in South Carolina, where nothing outside matches nothing inside, like I grew up a pretty lonely kid. It's really tough, I think, when you present as other in a space where there are physical codes for what it means to belong. And in South Carolina, a lot of that was being white and being blonde and going to church, right? Like I was in a very particular community that books were my haven to elsewhere. Like books were the portal that really allowed me to find myself and see that, okay, there are other ways of living life and there are other ways to just exist. And there are literally other worlds. And I too have the possibility to be part of creating those other worlds. So yeah, I think there's nothing like like loneliness to really open the possibility of stories as portals to what else could be.
That's incredible. I think I can share a little bit of that as somebody who grew up also in an environment in which the outside didn't necessarily match the inside. I grew up in New Hampshire as really the only kid that looked like me in some instances. There were others, but it was very much a feeling of I don't know where I belong. Growing up, I was always kind of struggling to find that that groove, if you will, and it came easier to other kids because they didn't have the same lived experience as I did. So that's something that I definitely can relate to. And thank you for sharing that, Sana. When it comes to building building learning experiences,
Mm.
what are some of the what are some of your key kind of go tos, right? So, regardless of whether you're building for an audience that may be in, like you mentioned, for example, folks that have had to deal with trauma in their lives, or take any other demographic, perhaps. What are some of the principles that you gravitate to when it comes to building really impactful experiences?
So I think that there's always a baseline, and I use always intentionally as like a superlative, all encompassing word of, as you mentioned, right? Like a sense of belonging and a sense of trust. And I think so I work with a lot of teachers and we speak often about, right, we have these big picture goals of learning objectives and student outcomes and formative assessments. But at the end of the day, if you can create a safe environment, you've won. And that in of itself is a huge foundational piece to whatever comes next. So I think as a learning experience designer, I think a lot about how I'm building relationships with other stakeholders, specifically stakeholders on the ground, and how I can role model the type of trust and safety that I'm hoping for amongst us, for them also to then kind of take that exact same energy and role model it for the students that we're working with. And often it works both ways, right? Like we have some incredible teachers we work with who do that very naturally and then bring that same energy back to the team. And so I think also, not to be too grandiose and pie in the sky, but it really is like a classroom is a microcosm of the world that we live in. And so thinking through, okay, we do have really great influence in this classroom and we have such a big responsibility with that influence. How can this be a slice of the world that we wish to see? And so I think I, and the organizations that I'm part of really move from shared values and then use that as the foundation to then think, all right, and here's our specific activities and here's our specific formative assessments from that as foundation.
And what would you say has been kind of critical to you engaging stakeholders, especially when the stakeholders are in different geographies, different they grew up differently, and there's just a lot of perhaps there's perhaps as much that is dissimilar between the groups as you have common ground in your shared values. What are some of the strategies that you leverage, or some of the tools that have really helped you engage in this cross cultural exercise of empowerment?
I think shared silliness is a must. Like I I will get on my bandwagon. Icebreakers and intentional icebreakers are critical. Like to me, whenever you open, be it a new relationship, be it a meeting, be it, right, like it doesn't necessarily matter how micro. I think the first intention has to be the human in me sees the human in you. The human in me acknowledges the context that you came from and what you are now centering into. Um, I think it also is very important to acknowledge that there are differences. I think failings that I've had earlier in my career, or that I now can observe and see, like, okay, that's not how I would necessarily go about it, is trying to make everything the same. I think it's really important, again, to say, like, oh, here are our shared values. Here's where our whys overlap. And then I think incredibly important to be in, like, and here is the end of my expertise, and here is the end of my lived experience. Because I will say, right, just in the world that we live in, which is this integrated political geographic context, coming from the West, coming from the US, having such a strong command of English, I think there are things that are coded in that go with me, specifically when I work in contexts that have a more like developing type of code, right? And those codes do not necessarily map onto expertise, but I think they do sometimes, unfortunately, map onto power dynamics. And that's something that I'm really mindful of. And so thinking of what are ways what are ways in which to skew those power dynamics? What are ways in which to challenge that? What are ways in which to build comfortability that, unfortunately, this is the framework that we're working in, but we do not have to succumb ourselves to that framework. And so it can be as simple as having an icebreaker and encouraging the teachers to speak in their native tongue, right? Reminding them of how much expertise they have. We also have teachers who are incredibly fluent in English. And so I often also will move from the position of, I designed this curriculum. I know there are flaws. Here are the flaws that I think I'm seeing. And just leading by example of like, we want to fail and we want to fail quickly in order to serve students as best as possible. And I think making it really clear to teachers that feedback is something to be celebrated, like mistakes are something to be celebrated. So yeah, often I will role model. To give you a very specific example. I shared the text of a book, so it was done through a YouTube read aloud, and I was like, I actually think that the accent of that video was too hard to comprehend, and the material was pretty U.S. specific. And that then allowed teachers to just yes and, as opposed to start with that feedback, and then opened up this conversation about, okay, so if learning comprehension is our goal, what are ways that we can make it more culturally specific, right? And then teachers had different ideas of, well, I really love this book. I can pause the video and read it aloud in this way. We can do this cross schools. And so I think just role modeling the type of feedback and the type of environment, and then making it so comfortable that teachers do feel like their voice is heard, and that their voice is heard, again, not for anything political or interpersonal, but specifically towards the shared goal of serving the students.
I think that's incredibly important that your North Star remains focused on the student and on the takeaways and their experience, and the human centeredness of that experience, I think, is critical. And another big piece of this too, Sana, which I'm always curious to learn more about, as somebody who again lives a very cross-cultural existence day to day and has a lot of interest in how education as a you know as a theme, if you will, is so is so international. I mean, in its very essence, education is universal, right? Uh, in your work, what are some of the things that surprised you when you kind of transitioned from working with a more perhaps Western audience and looking at some of the challenges that are shaping how education is being perceived or delivered or nurtured in a place like Africa? What are some of the things that maybe you didn't think you'd learn about, but you ended up uh, really being able to learn from as you went down this experience?
I think I do need to qualify to say I don't have that much experience with Western education. Even when
Okay.
I was working in the children's play center, I was working with definitely like children that had come from various parts of the US, but also indigenous children, which
Mm,
are very much American children, but come with a specific cultural context in addition that I think, um, yeah, there are just particular supports around. Um,
hmm.
so let me, can I want to edit that out. I'm going to start my answer
Sure,
again.
sure. Please go
So
for it.
these are great questions, but I really want to think them through.
Please.
So yeah, most of my experience has not been in the West, actually. I would say most of my experience has been in hyper specific cultural contexts or looking from the Western gaze, international contexts. Um, I would say that I think some of the things that consistently come up that perhaps surprised me in the beginning and now I know to look for is that as much as there are specific learning goals for the students, there are also specific learning goals for facilitators and teachers getting comfortable with alternate forms of pedagogy. Like, I think that very much as a field, we applaud project based learning and we applaud play based learning and these hands on approaches. But I think there's also a reason why education started out lecture first. It's comfortable, it's easy, it's very highly structured. And so I think what has surprised, but also now I know to look for, is thinking of scaffolding, not just for students, but also for teachers and for systems, and how all three of those tiers consistently feed into one another. I also think something that surprises me, but now I look forward to, is the fact that in the beginning, there are certain projects or materials that are frowned upon. Like, I think I shared this story at the conference, how I had what I thought was a brilliant science activity designed about using static electricity from balloons and using that to drive aluminum tin cans. And the teachers at Duara were like, absolutely not. Balloons are inherent chaos. We will mob in our classrooms. Like, they essentially cooed and were like, we will not do balloons. But then in our fourth cycle, they were like, Sana, we're ready for balloons, right? And that sense that, all right, now these teachers are so comfortable with disambiguating the difference between chaos and child-led learning, because they often can look the same, right? A child-first classroom is louder, is messier, is less organized, is something that when a parent comes in, you have to reassure the parent that, like, this is learning, because it doesn't look like that traditional controlled model. But I think that's something that's very beautiful. And I'll also say, like, I don't think this is a surprise, and sorry that I keep framing every sentence this way. Um, but just something that's like lovely to relearn is that learning is perpetual and learning is lifelong. And so I think one of the most rewarding parts of teaching in any context is having the activities, right? Or like having the lesson plans and seeing what they do, but seeing all of the in between interstitial moments of how a classroom is managed and how there are student roles and how a teacher facilitates boundaries around their planning time and pick up and drop off. Like there is so much that goes into a school beyond learning. And I think it always surprises and delights me of figuring out, okay, here are all the hats a teacher has to wear. And here's how I can be as supportive as possible and helping them leverage their strengths in areas they want to grow in and figure out ways to offload things because there is already so much on their plate.
Yeah, that's incredible. I
So
mean,
if- okay.
okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sana.
I don't know if that was helpful. I was just going to disclaim.
No, no, that was incredibly helpful, incredibly, I think, enlightening for me as well, as somebody who has never been a classroom teacher, to be honest.
Mm.
And I can appreciate that the chaos and unpredictability of a children's classroom are also its greatest strengths, right? And being able to foster a culture in which you are allowed to fail. And I think vulnerability is something that you touched on earlier as well. You know, I don't know the answers potentially. Here's an assumption, here's an educated assumption about how we can nurture a great experience for this community of students. But hey, teachers, you know about this way better than I do, right? So I'm not going to mandate or dictate what should be done. I'm looking to you as a subject matter expert, as somebody who's on the ground working with these students. We have to collaborate together and in a spirit of mutual respect and understanding to bring about these shared values in the classroom, right? So I think that's incredibly empowering and something that I think a lot of students and teachers, I think folks in education maybe sometimes miss because, you know, at least in my experience, uh, a lot of education is not play based. It's much more, you know, did this person acquire a certain skill? Did they attain a certain score? And it's a lot more black and white, a lot more numeric driven and metrics driven than perhaps is beneficial, right?
I
Um,
will say, I have a lot of
please.
compassion for school systems that are that way because it
Mhm.
takes so much energy and time to do it otherwise. And so, like,
Mm.
again, in terms of teacher capacity, like, I really want to shout out teachers who have capacity for that. But I will say, like, the systems that we work in make it so tough that oftentimes it is upon the teacher to put yet one more thing on an already overflowing plate to have that methodology. Like, I think it's a wish, but just capacity and logistics and time wise, often really difficult to implement.
Yeah, no, I think that's incredibly important. And that takes me to, I guess, maybe my macro question here, which is I would love to see personally the model that you and your colleagues have been able to spearhead at Duara Education. I would love to see that take hold in more and more settings and playful learning become a more visible and, I guess, implemented methodology within the classroom. uh, what's your experience doing that, if you don't mind me asking, Sana? Like, where is the model expanding to different markets,
Mm.
different regions, to your knowledge? That's question one. And question two, what could we do to bring playful learning into the classroom more forcefully and have it be implemented?
I think it's so tough because in so many spaces, play is still not seen as learning. And I think a quote that is often used in this spaces, often attributed to Piaget or other formative child development specialists, is play is a child's work. But I think even that quote is problematic because it only justifies play in the context of work. And so I think our cultural understanding around play is seen that it either has to be distinct and separate or be mirrored onto what is now seen as the socialized, justifiable reason for anyone to go to school. So I will say, in some ways, I think the change has to be cultural. So a lot of the work that we do at Duara is also working with parents for them to see the value of play-based education. And the reason that we work so young is that parents do tend to trust early childhood education is a place where they're like, sure, this doesn't really matter, but when it matters, right, like 6 and above, that's when we will focus on formal, real education. And so that is kind of our window to be proof of concept, to show, look, see, these 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds are also learning colors and shapes and numbers and basic literacy. And look at all of these other skills that they have picked up in this very particular experimental model. And then those parents become our champions. And then those parents are like, yeah, I see value because I see how this younger sibling is doing compared to their older sibling at the same time. Or this school also taught my child how to read, but my child is now so kind. And I didn't realize that school could do that. So I would say that I think there has to be a cultural shift. It is such a big act of trust anytime parents put their children, or guardians, let me not be specific, like anytime guardians put children in schools. And so I think play-based schools, right, is like we take play seriously. And this play is still in pursuit of that shared goal. And so really pulling that out. And I will say, and I think you know this, but I guess for listeners, so Duara Education is a low resource school, which means that a lot of our resources are recyclable materials, easily found materials, built materials. And that is now a built-in challenge of, all right, we have to also support our teachers in acquiring these materials and in using these materials in a classroom. Whereas worksheets are easier. Worksheets are yes and no. And so I guess I feel like for play-based education to really take off, one, there has to be a culture shift and willingness for both parties to be part of that culture shift, both parties being the school system and the guardians of the students. And two, there has to be a willingness to adapt resources to create the materials that are needed for play-based education, and for that play-based education to be sustainable, and for that play-based education to be intergenerational and work with a wide array of ages. I don't know if that answered your question.
No, it absolutely did. It hit all the points that I was curious in learning more about. And I've seen very in kind of in passing models instituted in other countries, like in Finland. I think a lot of maybe listeners may have also heard that they have a very unorthodox, if I can call it, approach to education, where a lot of the early childhood learning is done in more of a playful environment. You don't have you don't have homework assigned to students and kind of the traditional model of everybody sitting in rows and the teacher lecturing the students and doing worksheets and all of that. So I think this is a call to action for listeners and those that are in the education space to really look into how playful learning can enable incredible outcomes. I mean, you have firsthand knowledge of this, Sana, in the work that you're doing and in the community building that you're spearheading. Where can somebody find out more about playful learning, either as a methodology and also your work? I would love for you to share how people can follow what you're doing at both at Duara and also elsewhere, in case they have interests in implementing something like this.
Absolutely. I think first I want to nuance playful learning. So, playful learning, play based learning. I think there are many camps in which those are very distinct things. Kathy Hirsch Pasek does lots of work on that disambiguation, on what that whole range can look like. And I think practitioners can really start where they feel comfortable. And so I think we at Duara, and I'm also a big proponent of the next right thing. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, now I have a playful classroom overnight. It can be simply like, I want to take a play-based approach into reading comprehension. Here is one way that I can do this. And then slowly building on from comfort to discomfort, or I would say like easy add-on to existing curriculum to bigger add-on to existing curriculum. In terms of my own work, I do play-based education in a whole host of spaces. So we've really focused on the formal learning space, but I also do a lot in the informal learning space with art installations and books and TV and radio and insert choice noun here. I am most active on LinkedIn. I also have an Instagram where I post various work. But I would say that those are the two social media platforms that I use the most. And then I have a portfolio that kind of showcases the breadth of some of what I've been speaking of.
That's incredible, and I'll be sure to include all those resources in the show notes. Any parting thoughts, Sana, for our listeners who are? What would you say is the most important takeaway or gift that your work at Duara and everything else that you've been doing? What would you like people to walk away with?
I think often when we do this work, and we work in an entrepreneurial space as well, so we're very much building the plane as we fly it. We compare ourselves to the absolute best school system. We compare ourselves to the ideal of like, what would it be like if only? And I think a grounding thought is, wow, that's wonderful for a version 10. The first right thing is, are we doing better than the other alternatives? Are we doing better than nothing? And I think sometimes it's really helpful to think from that perspective, because I do feel like people in the education space, right? Like, we're not here for the money. It really is a mission driven space. And I think in that mission, sometimes we put so much heart into it, we forget to even celebrate the little wins. And so I think taking that step back and saying, okay, how does this look if we're looking at the landscape from the floor and not just the ceiling, and taking that into consideration.
Incredible. Thank you, Sana. I truly enjoyed this conversation. I've learned so much in the last half an hour about not only the work that you've done, but also great ways for all of us in the education space and in the community building space to really learn more about these methodologies and these frameworks so that hopefully we can make those incremental improvements and continue to really build, I think, a more human centered and learner centered uh, experience for those that we work with and those in our circle. So thank you so
Awesome.
much, Sana, for your time. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity.
Likewise. Thank you.